Hi, y'all. Very excited to be here with Sarah and Steven talking about pay equity. I'm very hyped for this conversation, especially to be joined by two incredible people. My name's Annika. I head design at Somewhere Good, and I'm excited to be both moderating and being a part of this conversation. So I feel like we should just get into it. Also, hoping that you can't hear the slightly haunting sound of an ice cream truck like passing by my apartment, but we won't get into that. We're just going to go ahead and jump into it. So, I'm going to start us off with some of the data points from the report itself, just to root us in some of the work that was done. So the report itself surfaced a lot of different gaps when it came to income and job stability. It found that cisgender gay men received significantly higher pay and job stability than other queer identities. Alongside that, Black, Middle Eastern, and Hispanic/Latinx designers made a larger percentage of those that reported a lower income average. And 41% of trans respondents lost employment due to COVID-19 in comparison to 29% of cis designers. This data is pointing to a larger structural pattern and how even within queer contexts, we see familiar disparities existing when it comes to income, when it comes to job stability. So the question that I want to start us off with is, for all of us here, where has this pattern shown up in your own experience, in your journey within the design industry? And feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick it off. So I think I'm going to speak. So I've worked as a designer and also as a hiring manager and a design leader. And so just acknowledging my privilege as a white person, I think I've had a pretty different experience from what the report was speaking to in terms of people, in terms of the experiences people were having. So I want to actually speak to a lot of what I've experienced as a hiring manager and the things that I've seen from other hiring managers. So I think a big thing that comes up here a lot is, how do people come into becoming designers, especially in big tech? I think we know in places that have huge applicants, we see things like automated resume readers. So looking for keywords, looking for schools people might have attended, looking for connections and things that people have that not everyone is afforded those privileges, right? And so being really mindful of that when we're hiring, that sometimes we need to do different types of work in terms of finding the right people. It comes up in referrals too, right? Referrals are huge, especially in big tech. And access to referrals is dependent on who you know. And given the demographic of most tech companies that skew white, cis, and men, we're introducing bias into the system that we're just perpetuating. So we start to ask ourselves, what are other ways that we can involve people and get people into design, especially with such a huge tech climate that doesn't involve these systems that were set up to only benefit white, cis people?
Absolutely. And what I want to add too is my own personal experience within the creative industry. And since going up in the seniority ladder, so much of the hiring practices that I've experienced and seen egregiously have been backdoor hiring practices. Or quite simply, you have a design leader coming in who oftentimes cis, straight, white individual, male, who has their Rolodex of all these designers that they want to bring on board, that they've already worked with, that they know. And they're like, I worked with them already, tried and true, bring them in. And so more often than not, you see a lot of people who already have privilege working in these positions, already making great salary, then going into different organizations and then also commandeering higher salaries because they have insider knowledge and intel. And especially when it comes to just who gets put into the door, we also hear this word of professionalism or cultural fit. And I think oftentimes there's so many ways in which inequity is masked in terms of not being able to see it as it's happening. And so for the most part, what I will also acknowledge is my privilege as a cis male, Asian male within the industry of design. I've definitely been able to enter spaces in which, because that was the larger majority, but at the same time, especially at the intersection of being, especially somebody who is queer and Asian, I've also seen where sometimes I'm the only person in the room represented as well.
Yeah, completely. I feel that in a similar way with like the topic of professionalism, that's where I've seen a lot of nefarious shit happening across my career. And I've worked in really large corporate settings to agencies to startups, and just seeing the ways that, you know, one gets a 1-year review, like for your salary increase, or peer reviews, or these tools that are supposed to, you know, analyze the way that you work. And if you are open to a raise, a lot of them are rooted in these ideas of professionalism that are just tied up with whiteness. I think about how Kenneth Jones and Tema Okun, who are two researchers, talk about white supremacy as a culture and how that moves through behaviors that are really a part of Western US ways of living. So that's ideas of perfectionism, of a sense of urgency, of how there's only one way to be analyzed and how that needs to come from a top-down situation. And that is so strong in agency culture as well as other design culture spaces as well. And so when it's come to my peer reviews or reviews with higher ups across my career, I've noted the ways that these concepts of what it means to be professional in an environment are not made for me. And it's spaces where I have had a lot of issues before. And I think even within the report itself, it's important to underscore, like we've been talking about, how even within the data itself, there's more opportunity for some nuance. Like in this report, the dominant majority of designers were white, and there were only, I believe, 5% of Black designers, and a smaller amount of percentages of other populations of what as well. So just thinking about the statistics itself here. Yeah.
That's super interesting too, and what you're saying, Annika, about just those like tenets of white supremacy and how I think about them, how they are also, how we think about how designers are also experiencing that type of those, you know, racist limitations, right? Like things like speed at which you have to move and perfectionism. How does that affect creativity? And a lot of us are designers in corporate places, either big or small, where we are really focused on efficiency and time and just getting things out the door, right? And throwing things at the wall and testing them, and design thinking and all this stuff that is rooted in white supremacy. And how do we as designers maintain our creativity and also, you know, exist within these structures? How do we start to challenge those is something that I think about a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's sometimes very inconspicuous, right? How sometimes we're not even aware of the way in which we co-opt into systems of power to give ourselves the upper hand as well. And as you talked about, Sarah, right? Speed, cost efficiency. We're starting to see a lot of that show up in UX designers' portfolio, right? They're like, show us the impact of your designs, and you scroll down to the bottom of someone's portfolio. I made them this much money. I got them this many, blah, 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 blah. But at the end of the day, you know, at least in my work and the work that we do as an organization at QTBIPOC Design is really sometimes challenging the norms of the way in which we construct our design and our design methodologies. And so one part is, how do we bring ourselves back from user experience / business experience to human experience? And what does that mean? And also one more thing I'll add too is, to your point, to both your points, the importance of intersectionality, right? Which is, how do these myriad of identities we have kind of either complement or meet at different points to create different identities and different lived experiences. And so I think that's why it's really important not just to have, right, just one queer person or one Black employee or, you know, one queer Black employee, but really the myriad across all different identities, but multiple folks representing those identities, so that we can get true community with different folks' lived experience being representative. Yeah.
Completely. I think that actually flows very well into our next question, unless Sarah, if you had anything more to note here. Word, cool. So on that note, oftentimes when we're thinking about, you know, solutions and just the whole this whole concept as a whole, diversity is brought up, and oftentimes that's talked about as just bringing more Black or brown or POC or trans or queer people to the center, but that can often sometimes come with a lack of intention that falls flat in terms of impact. So can you share your perspective on the role of representation within this design space, especially as it intersects with income and accessibility?
I could start. Don't jump in all at once. It's funny. Our side of the camera controls is intricately set up. Props to all the people managing all this. But what I will say is, again, back to intersectional identities, we see when you sit at the position of either power or lacking of power, and you have multiple compounding effects of those identities, again, you see disproportionately lower and lower and lower pay. Conversely, higher and higher and higher pay for those people who sit at the proxy of identities. Let's say you're cisgender, right? You're male, you're white, you sit at the proxy of heteropatriarchy, so much power. Whereas the flip side, if you're trans, Black, queer, also you come from a different socioeconomic background, you experience disability, like it can go on. And so I think the real important part of it is to, I mean, I'm sure we get this question all the time of businesses asking, how can we support you? But I think the first question is just ask us how you can support us. And I think we can also do a lot of that work internally as a community as well, where we can just come up to one another and just ask, how can I support you? I think oftentimes we sometimes overstep our boundaries as queer folks and queer community members because we're like, oh, we're queer, we understand everything. But as a part of uplifting each other and the complexities of our identities, I think just having some of these conversations can be really critical at helping us.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes so much sense, Stephen. I think too, it's in thinking about if you're a design leader, if you're somebody who's part of a team where you're thinking more about the design strategy overall, there's representation of who the designers are on your teams. And there's also what type of designs are you putting out from your company, right? And considering what is that rooted in? Like, where are those design standards coming from? I'm sure like many of you have heard about the concept of decolonizing design, but I think it's something very important to think about, which is many of our, traditional design school curriculums and our sort of standards for what is good and bad design come from this Eurocentric, American, mostly cis men, sort of gods of the design world, right? And that is such a narrow perspective that we are all, or not all, but many of us are then trained and sort of put through to this pipeline into the design world, right? These are people who get educated, learning about this very narrow standard. And then those are the people that become designers, design leaders. And so we have to consider, I think, especially if you are a white person, a white leader in design, educating yourself on other histories, other cultures, other design, and making sure to bring that into the fold when you are in turn educating future designers, when you're making design decisions, things like we were talking about before, like efficiency. A lot of the modernist principles of design are rooted in this like standardization that's essentially whitewashing and taking away, any culture of non-white people and cultures from the system. So thinking about that when you are a leader is so important. There's a lot of research out there about design thinking and how that is perpetuating white supremacy, about decolonizing design. So there are definitely some resources I'm happy to share and that are out there that I really encourage people to think about, because it is such a huge way that we are shaping the design future that we are responsible for undoing as we continue the work forward.
Completely. And I feel like alongside that role of people that are in leadership positions, I'm thinking about how you're actually tangibly showing up for pay equity within your design space. Like I think about with the uprisings of 2020, I saw a lot of design agencies and also larger companies getting called out for their total lack of support for Black designers in their spaces. And, you know, I saw a lot of task forces being made and a lot of calls for diversity. But my question is, how does that diversity translate to your pay amount? Like, what does that actually mean? It really means nothing if you're bringing more people to the table, but not actually providing them with the resources to thrive, with the resources to advance, with the resources to learn more. So I feel like that becomes a danger of representation within these design spaces. It's just like, okay, we're gonna bring more people to the table. We're not gonna give you anything actually to make this a sustainable space where you can grow and where you can learn. And I think that representation also can translate to, you know, like having like very like regimented, like, okay, we have Black History Month and then we have Pride Month, and this is where we're going to give attention to our employees and our team members. And it's in this very regimented ways. And it can just show a lack of intersectionality, as Stephen was noting, and also just condensing all of your support into these months and then not showing up for it for the rest of the year is just another dangerous slide.
Yeah. And then to add on that, again, it's how are we co-opting into positions of power or power structures? And one of it is, right, performative activism, how we're outwardly trying to portray ourselves in order to gain power, in order to gain recognition, in order to gain more monetary support. And I think there was a report done by Ad Age where about 30% of all the different ad agencies that signed on to pledges saying they're going to hire more Black employees, Black designers across the whole gamut, just silently disappeared. They just took that off. They're like, sorry about it. And I think as individuals, both allies and both people across different intersectional identities, we need to hold our companies accountable when they want to, say they're going to do X, Y, Z, be a part of the performative action. And so I think that's a little bit of just, doing our work of documenting, writing things down, taking receipt, inventory of what's to come. And then in terms of some of the, just to talk about professionalism and how things are gendered and just the concept of queerness. One book I'll recommend is The Queer Art of Failure. It was recommended to me by a speaker on the last panel, Raquel. It's an amazing book, but it's also concept of as queer people, the identity is really just a failure on like the gamut of like hetero patriarchy, but to embrace the concept of failure is really how we seek liberation. And so it's a really interesting take of just how we can even find our positionality within culture. And sometimes it's moving towards the opposite is really how we'll find our liberation. Yeah.
Cool. I feel like that is a good space to transition to a new cue, which is what comes to mind when you think of the word transparency within the design space.
Yeah, I mean, one that was mentioned in the last panel, but I just want to echo it, is putting the salary range on the job description, like just being so transparent. There is literally no reason not to be. I mean, we all know why people don't do it, but there is no real reason not to do it. And just don't waste people's time. Be really upfront and clear. This is going to attract, the talent that you want to attract. And it's I think helpful too for people getting into the space. There are so many new people joining the design world now, just due to more access for people getting into the field, which I think is amazing. And being able to be very clear about helping people navigate those spaces, I think is such an important part.
Yeah, and for me, I think transparency is data and how we collect data and how we use data to tell a story. Especially the big pretense of this whole conference today is really around the data that we collected from our communities and how that shows and shines into light a lot of the things that we have yet to work on, that we can work on and improve, but also, especially when we're in a corporate setting, we can add pressure to our teams who say, I want, better DEI stuff. Let's collect our data. Let's do an inventory, right, of who actually is working. And then the other part, when we see overrepresentation, specifically Asian communities, can we even disaggregate that from this larger umbrella to even identify specific pockets of underrepresented identities within this larger umbrella?
Completely. I would also add telling your peers your salary, telling your peers what is your hourly rate, telling your peers your salary and your rate across your career and when it changed and why it changed. I feel like, looking to like folks, if you're in a design space where there's more of kind of like a hierarchical way that the leadership is thought of, it's really important to just be talking amongst one another about how much money you're making. And I think sometimes that comes with like a weirdness or an awkwardness from folks. And it can sometimes lead into like, I don't even know, like a competitive strangeness, when really it is one of the most powerful tools that I myself have learned. And just having, Stephen, like you were saying, that data is so important for being able to understand what is going on and what room there is for me to be moving.
Yeah. And sometimes, again, it's like we feel these pressures, right, of not being able to speak and voice all these things because, again, the system that we're in doesn't want us to say these things.
100% too. And I, along with salary, which I would say number one, and rate is a really good one too on the freelance side as well. Just the sort of the wealth of knowledge that people have around design tools, design practices, design principles, sharing those, like having sessions. I think this was mentioned in the other panel too, which I loved, is just having sessions where you're teaching each other how to use these tools, where you're doing sessions together. I think a lot of the things we see on YouTube are super like high quality and cool, but they can feel very overwhelming. So just being real with people and, I'm going to, show you how to do this type of animation. And, you can show me how to do this type of, vector illustration or creation, sharing these resources. So many of these things are kept in this ivory tower. Like things like fonts are so expensive, like the ridiculous things that just people, if they don't have access to them, especially as students, when you're starting out and learning, it puts you at such a disadvantage that is absolutely inappropriate in order to get people into the system. So I truly believe, whatever resources you have access to and you can share, you really should be doing that to help level that playing field when people get into the professional world.
Ooh, I just felt you on the font judging. Oh, I hate that.
It's ridiculous. I mean, I understand if font is an art form, and I absolutely appreciate that, the people who do that work, but it is just absolutely ridiculous, the access that people get and starting off, and just the inequity in that, like seeing that in when I went through school, just some access that people have to materials and resources that other people don't. That relates to time that you have as well to put in, and how that affects your projects and how that affects your internships and future prospects. I mean, it is all linked from the start. And so the more that we can be sharing this work and these resources with ourselves internally as a group, the more power we're putting back into the group and taking it, away from those systems that are oppressing.
Completely. I'm going to move to the next question. And Stephen, I'm going to direct this one at you first, just because of your work with freelance. But one of the trends we generally saw in the report was more people moving from full-time roles to freelance roles. And we've been talking a lot about working, within a company. But I'm curious if you believe freelance is a way that we can avoid some of these disparities that have been surfaced in the report or not.
Absolutely. And so a little bit of context into my history. I've been in the corporate space for a long time, mostly with ad agencies and a lot of the big ad agencies here in New York City. And I was just hitting this ceiling where I was performing at a very senior level, but promotions, salary raises were just always dangled on top of me, and it was just never coming. Except when I would jump around, it would happen. Crazy how that happens. And so I decided to just go freelance because I had a repertoire with a lot of folks, clients, other past employees, colleagues who would bring me on. And it was just so crazy, the stark difference between how people took me seriously as a freelancer versus when I was working full time. When I was like, yeah, like not working past this time, they're like, okay, great. Oh, yes. We heard you. Meanwhile, we were working the salary over at an agency. They're like, it's not 11 yet. Keep going. We'll order you dinner. That dinner. And I think this has been a big kind of story across a lot of different people I've spoken with within our space too, where shifting to freelance was really this shift in the power dynamics. And also, what is fascinating too is also the way in which we interview for different positions and roles. Coming in as a freelancer is another very viable opportunity as well. And so I've freelanced at many different places, and they're like, oh my gosh, yeah, we want you to work full time. Meanwhile, when I was applying just with my resume, my portfolio, it wasn't doing that job. And so it's quite interesting how we can start to think about just even the way we apply using not just, a portfolio or resumes, but just ways of working, even to shift the power dynamics and structures. Because oftentimes, right, freelancing, there's a wide open door. They're like, we need help right now. And you might be able to be ushered in quickly and they could see your work. And so especially for those who are really talented, like all of us are, it's a great way to at least get your foot in the door and people to see you beyond just your resume and your portfolio.
Thank you. Sarah, do you have anything to add there?
No, I think that was well said.
I agree. Amazing. Okay. So I'm going to start leading us into one of our final questions. So each of us work in design environments that show a wider inclusivity of designers than most design spaces. Sarah with working with her, Stephen with QTBIPOC design, and myself with Somewhere Good. So what have these design spaces meant to you in the larger conversation of the future of design as an industry? And Sarah, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I just feel so extraordinarily lucky to be working on a team that's making a product for queer people by queer people. It is like such a gift to do that. And one of the ways I see that really showing up, especially in the design side, is the ability to really center user research in design and speaking with real users about our product before we release those features. Of course, it's something that I think a lot of companies talk about. There's always the big talk about research, and then there's the question of, is there the practice of it, and is there the time for it? But one of the nice things about her is we do spend that time to do that. I think because as queer people, we acknowledge that the queer community is such a huge, diverse place in terms of race, in terms of class, in terms of so many different factors. And these are all people who are on our app. So it's really important that before we release a feature, I might be designing the feature, but I have a very narrow, limited view on queerness just based on who I am. And so being able to speak with real users, get their feedback, understand their experiences and where there might be challenges or needs that I might be missing as one person, that our team might be missing as individuals. That emphasis on research and really getting back to thinking about the user first is something that I've just been able to bring to the team and encourage that we do. And I think it has made a big difference in the types of products that we release.
Yeah, and as for me, QTBIPOC design was really a love letter to the industry and the space, where I was very much oftentimes the only queer person of color in many, many executive rooms. And it was a space in which we just wanted to empower and help provide design education for those who come from backgrounds that are ever, you know, or creativity or design is a skill and a trade that's talked about. And so what's really exciting is just creating and trying to think of just ways in which we can create safety within community through community specific for queer BIPOC identities. And what's really cool is we are launching our next UX Bootcamp course, which is going to run in September. Our application just came out, and it's a free subsidized program that's taught by myself and a few other teachers to just provide education and empower folks within our community and our space to succeed and thrive within this industry, because it doesn't have to be the way it is today, and we can change it up. What about you, Annika?
I feel that energy so much. So I work at a startup, like I said, somewhere good. And we're a small team. We're about 9 people, but we're all people of color. We're Black and queer founded. And it really has been a game changer for me to be able to work with so many other Black trans people within a design space and being able to just like create a wider margin of safety for myself at work, and how that supports me in being able to be creative in a way that isn't so segmented as I've had in other spaces. And just, you know, I think in other spaces I've experienced having to block off a certain part of my personality and just a certain part of my life. And I just come to work with like trying to think of the right word, not my whole self. And that's not to say that folks shouldn't have boundaries with work, because I definitely do. But there is just a wider sense of safety that I'm able to hold in my workspace. And so to me, I think off of what y'all are saying, it really means a lot to me in the future of design, with giving the designers that have been left out of the spotlight the tools to build our own tables, to build our own resources, to be providing these wider margins of transparency. And so with that, unless y'all had any other notes, okay, cool. I believe we can move into questions from the audience. So I am going to start with any tips on starting the conversation on showing full salary transparency internally across all employees in a small agency. Sarah, I'm wondering if you might have some notes here.
You know, I really wish that I did. I do think that I don't have experience here, but I think something that I would consider when thinking about this is think about sort of who has access to the power and who has access to that type of information, and what's your relationship with those people, and how do you have those types of conversations. I think especially at a small company where you have, you know, a few people in a leadership position and, you know, not like a huge org chart of people to deal with, you're actually at an advantage where you can have those kind of conversations with people in leadership positions to talk about the importance of it, to talk about everything we just discussed and why it is so important to have those conversations. And if the people at the top of your company don't want to have those kind of conversations, I think it's important for you to evaluate, do you want to be at that kind of company? You know, is that the right place where you want to be giving your time and energy? And see what they're saying. I think there are definitely other ways to do that just by sharing internally with each other, without having to go through the sort of top level management. But if you're looking to do it that way, I think just developing those relationships, if you have that ability, and if you are someone in a place of privilege, being able to speak up and have those conversations, so it's not reliant on other people to do so.
Completely. Stephen, anything to add here?
I think that was good. I mean, the only thing I'll add is it doesn't hurt to add and try and see how that resonates, right, with people applying for jobs. And I think we could always approach it in the sense of let's test and see, but test in the sense of let's put some of those numbers out on like job applications, for example.
Completely. I'm gonna roll into the next question just because we are tight on time, but I'm going to add, do you have some tips to start and manage a diverse team? And I'm wondering if y'all would let me speak to this one first, because I just had like a reaction to it. But I remember being at a design meetup event when I was just getting started in design. And it was like a bunch of design leaders. They were all white. They were mostly dudes, except for one person. And they started having a conversation about how they couldn't find Black designers. And they were just like, well, they don't apply. So we don't know. Shrug, bring yourself. And like, I feel like that is so often like the attitude when it comes to this. And I am thinking about how I'm a self-taught designer. I did not know design was a career, like for real, until I was in college and I was doing design through concert posters, and I didn't even know that was design. And so many of the people on Somewhere Good's team are from spaces where we didn't even know that it was design at the time we were doing it. So I think you really need to look hard at where you're looking exactly. Like if you're like looking in the spaces that are already known, like for design, then I think you need to widen a bit. You need to widen where you're looking for people. You need to go to the spaces that may not even know this is a career, that may not know that this is a viable, creative option, rather than leaning on these other types of spaces. Any other adds, Sarah Stevens, to that? Word, okay. So we are going to do our last question here. So on adding diversity in design, how do you fight the super token culture? Oof. Go ahead, Sarah. I'm sorry. I thought, Stephen, were you pointing to Sarah?
I thought you were going, Stephen.
I was pointing at both of you. I feel like, Annika, you had a strong reaction to it. Do you want to start?
Yeah, totally. I mean, to me, I would question, my question to your question is what super token culture means. My own interpretation of what that is that like I'll use myself for example, when I'm like the one Black trans designer on a team and being used as the spokesperson when working on a project that isn't just focused on white people. So I feel like, to me, that looks like really advocating for other designers to be a part of the team itself. And again, doing that kind of work with bringing design education to these wider spaces that aren't as accessible to folks that have access to this, to bring more people into the team. Beyond that, I mean, I've straight up just said no, no to things. And I know that that is like a very hard thing in some types of spaces. But if I can sense that I am being used as a token without any form of support, without anything deeper below that, then refusal becomes my option.
Yeah. My only tip is, if you're getting asked to do extra work, you better be paid, you better be compensated for it. None of this DEI stuff for free, leading all these subcommittees, all this stuff. We're asked to just show up and do the job, right? And we'll do it. But all these extra things, there needs to be compensation, boo. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Will not work for free.
Yes.
I think that is a great place to stop. So thank you both so much for this amazing convo, and thank you all so much for listening and for being here. This was amazing.
Thanks, y'all. Thanks so much.
Thank you.